Tom Stewart is the Executive Director of the National Center for Middle Market at Ohio State University's Fisher College of Business. He's written lots of books. He talked last year about his most recent book, which was Woo, Wow, and Win, along service design and customer delight. He's been an editor for Harvard Business Review. He's worked for consulting companies, and he still does great pieces of writing on Facebook and other places. So he makes me laugh constantly. Dave Snowden is the Chief Scientific Officer for Cognitive Computing, Cognitive Edge, excuse me. That was a slip of the tongue, wasn't it? Oops. He has worked with IBM and other consulting companies, and he blogs, and he hikes, and he tells great stories. So the two of them are with us today because Dave and I had this very interesting conversations in the spring, and I'd like you to tell them that story first, if you would, Dave.
And I'll correct it after you get it.
Well, there, I knew this would happen.
I've got to try and remember the sequence as well. Now, Jane came over to a brilliant festival, if you don't know it, every year in Britain. It's at the Hay Book Festival, but it's a parallel one. It's a festival of philosophy and music. So it's literally 10 days of discussing with scientists and philosophers, and it's a lot of fun, all right? So we go every year. Either way, we were telling stories as you do, and Jane was commenting on the amount of different gins we had available in the house we'd hired, and gin is a wonderful thing. And I remembered when I was trying to get together with Tom and Leif should be here, right? He's meant to be here. Yes. He's ruining the story by not being here, all right? And we just couldn't do it. The emails were going backwards and forwards. And I went to Heathrow, Terminal 3, walked into the men's toilet, right, and found Tom stood there washing his hands because I'd gone in to change clothes to get on a flight and discovered Tom doing the same thing. We started a chat, and this voice came from one of the stalls, and it was Leif.
Yeah. And we'd all been at the same conference in London at different times, had not seen one another.
Didn't realize it.
We were all in Terminal 3. You were going to Boston. I was going to New York. Leif was going to Milan. And we were all changing out of wool and into cotton.
That's it.
For those, which was a
in
case
exactly
of,
the same toilet.
Which is a case of best practice. Sure. Yeah. Not exactly the same restroom, yes, but not the same stall. Right.
But I was fascinated. I was fascinated. You know, here they're all trying to get together and just...
But it was best practice.
Serendipity that they happened to be in the same restroom, in the same terminal, in the same airport, in the same city. So interesting ability to knowledge share. But we have more techniques for doing that now. And so I wanted to ask them each to reflect upon KM and sort of their experiences and tell us a little bit about their view of knowledge sharing going forward. Tom, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, it's an easy question. I started getting interested in this stuff in 1991. I was at Fortune at the time, and our then managing editor, Fortune had traditionally published a year-end thing called the most fascinating business people of the year, and it turned out that that's a rather shallow well. And so Marshall said, why don't we do something about fascinating ideas? And I got tapped for that because I'm a bit of a magpie. And as I was kicking around, I ended up talking to a fellow named Ralph Steyer who ran a company called Johnsonville Foods. You may see their ads. They're sausage makers in Wisconsin. And not finding that sufficiently interesting, he doubled as a consultant to, among other things, Lockheed Martin. And he said, you know, he was the one who first used the phrase intellectual capital to me. And he said, you know, in the 19th century, the capital that mattered was land, then it became money, and now it's become knowledge, and intellectual capital is the most important thing. So that's sort of how I got into this thing back before anybody knew anything about it. And I think Dave was in the middle of getting his greats in in his DPhil in Greats or something like this. So Dave was learning everything, and I was learning this small thing. And Leif actually showed up in my office after that article, the first Fortune article about that appeared, and gave me his business card as a director of intellectual capital at Scandia. And I said, oh my God, I sort of felt like an endangered species, and I found another one of my kind in the, in the forest. So that's how I sort of got interested in it, in the idea of that the assets that mattered most to companies were the intangible assets, not the financial or physical assets, that the intangible assets made the difference. So I'm saying that because this was not about knowledge management. This was about thinking about what are the most important resources or assets that a firm might bring to bear on whatever problems it had. And it became KM later, and it to some extent became KM when people decided you could put technology around it. I remember going to a conference in Nashville, Tennessee with Tom Davenport, and it was a conference of HR information systems people. So we had like IT and HR in the same room, and I got up to give a speech and I said, we're caught here between the devil and the deep blue sea, or whatever it is, the Scylla and Charybdis of customer non-centric bureaucracies. But as we arrived there was this new magazine that was called, I think, KM. And Tom started picking it up, and it turned out that it was called KM, but it had been an information graphics, an IT graphics magazine, and they simply slapped the label on. But from that point, and really that conference is when I date my theory that KM's biggest problem, and in my second book I have a chapter titled The Case Against Knowledge Management, has been its lack of connection to customers. And so we could talk a little bit about that, but for the last 20 years, I've been out there looking for connections to customers, and I've been doing some work about that. I talked a little bit about last year and a little bit about it 3 or 4 years before that. We can get to that, but that's sort of where I came from. Is the most important stuff is the most important resource is the knowledge, and this KM stuff may actually. It came later, and I've always been skeptical of the acronym while recognizing that there's a whole lot of stuff that happens if you don't manage your knowledge. So,
yes. That's great. That's great. And I often just use the term knowledge sharing, but Dave has his own take on that, so we'll let Dave talk a little bit about that now.
Yeah, my own journey was interesting. I originally wrote my thesis on decision support systems. And that was a lot of fun because there wasn't an academic who knew anything about it. So I had a supervisor who I knew more than the supervisor. So I said, I'll send you it and you can correct the thesis for grammar, but don't interfere in between times.
Best practice that he's kept up with.
Yeah, so you always keep ahead of the game, right? I mean, I was writing decision support systems for people like Guinness. So I was actually an application specialist, but I also could code. And that was a period where you could do both, and that was quite creative. So it was how do you build systems that support decision making? Then I moved into a strategy role, and then IBM took us over, which was a very scary phenomenon. But for me, that was the best of times and worst of times because they decided I was a creative. I'd done the turnaround on the company they bought. So I got given a free-floating role, do whatever you want and we'll pay you a salary. And just to tell you a real story on this, and this is hysterically funny in many ways, right? My boss was a really good boss. He was good top cover. It was the days when IBM encouraged mavericks. And he worked out my targets at the end of the first year. So at the end of the first year, he sat down and said, what did you do? Yeah, I agree with that. You achieved your targets. I got my bonus. HR got upset about that for some reason. So the next year they said, you've got to actually agree the scheme in advance. And he said, I'm going to teach them a lesson. And the IBM corporate strategy basically said, we're going to become a service company, not a manufacturing company. That means very senior people in IBM will be disturbed by this, and we have to protect the people who challenge it. So he said, you're one of those people. So my bonus scheme that year was I got $3,000 for every director of IBM who demanded in writing I was fired. And $5,000 for every vice president, right? And he put it into HR, and they went absolutely ballistic, right? And he said, it's a strategic goal, I have the right level of authority, it's measurable, yeah, and you can't challenge it. And I overachieved on the target that year. So it was like, And IBM was, and these days they don't have the room to do that, but it was like everybody, it was that, I knew that it was the court jester role. It was kind of like senior executives wanted somebody who shook things up a bit, and they were encouraged to do it. Either way, I then got into sort of, my job was to create new things, and this book came out by a guy called Nanaka and Thatcher, whatever it was, called The Knowledge Creating Company. And I remember buying a copy of this, reading the first chapter, which basically said Western philosophy categorizes things, Eastern philosophy doesn't, all right? I took one look at, my degree's philosophy, and I threw the book in the bin, and then I had to buy another copy because it became a bestseller. And I remember looking at that and thinking this is fundamentally and utterly mistaken. This is the wrong place to start knowledge management. Because the Secchi model, the concept of tacit to explicit knowledge conversion, is going to make everything not work. Yeah, because it's okay if you're producing bread makers in a Japanese manufacturing. In fact, it's quite a good book about how to do knowledge transfer in manufacturing in commodity production. It was a crap book about how to do knowledge, for example, in the service sector, where you can't codify. And it went really badly wrong from that. So when I started to develop KM, that was actually when we got into narrative. Because we said there's got to be more than things that can be codified. Yeah, the minute you actually, if everybody's collaboration is on a computer screen, on a keyboard, typing things, interacting, it's impoverished in terms of the way things work. You can write down about 10 to 15% of what you're capable of knowing. And the scary thing is if you reduce knowledge management to what to be written down, you're reducing your own intellectual capacity to 10 to 15% of what you're capable of. Yeah? So that was when we moved into narrative databases and those sort of areas. And then I got into complexity theory because it was obviously we were dealing with high levels of uncertainty, and I've always been intellectually curious, so that really started to take over. And that came to the attention of the CIA, which was a bit of a shock. So I suddenly got this phone call and discovered the CIA were members of the Institute for Knowledge Management. This is after the end of the knowledge wars in IBM, which had a formal peace negotiation.
Did you get a bonus for that?
Yeah, no,
when the CEO asked you to get fired because you talked to me?
I survived. I'll tell that story in a minute, all right? I mean, that one's a story for the end, all right?
Okay.
So either way, I suddenly got this phone call and discovered the CIA were members of the Institute for Knowledge Management, and I wondered what that obscure company was who turned up to everything. So I ended up in Washington, and they wanted to know about the work we were doing on complexity and narrative. And then that ended up with a DARPA program which led up to 9/11. I was actually in the Pentagon the day before 9/11, flew out the next night, and that kind of like changed everything. Because then knowledge became far more important than some trivial issue about codification in the company. It became how do we understand the preconditions for terrorism, how do we identify weak signals. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Can I interrupt
you
a second? I was invited down to the CIA for a gathering of the intelligence community in Langley before, probably about the same time you were. And I remember being escorted to the parking lot by the person who picked me up. And this comes right to what you were saying about the tacit to explicit model. He was saying, we need to understand this stuff because we are no longer dealing with a structured problem. In the Cold War, our problem was Russian troops through the Fulda Gap. That was the problem, and so if that was the problem, we could figure out how to solve it, and we could set up classification in terms of who needs to know, because we knew what the problem was. But if we don't know what the problem is, we don't know who needs to know. And so we cannot classify information in the sense of top secret, what you are allowed to know, if the problem is unstructured. And so they wrestled with this epistemologically, and you probably helped them figure it out.
It was worse than that. I actually used to have a matrix which went known, unknown, unknowable on 2 dimensions. And for Poindexter, I presented that in the Pentagon. And 3 weeks later, somebody gave a speech about unknown unknowables. And I wasn't able to use the matrix again until recently, or in terms of the way it worked.
There was a guy named William Fahey at Boston College who gave that matrix to me in my first book, and I think Rumsfeld picked it up from Liam. But
Will came different origins in this. I had the unknowable action on it, which was the key thing he missed, all right? Because unknowable is part of that. But the other interesting thing, if you look at the congressional report on 9/11, it basically says there was an over-focus on the NSA and an under-focus on the CIA, which I'd endorse.
Too much technology, not enough
Too much
people.
technology, too much belief in artificial intelligence, too much belief in algorithms, and neglecting the human sensor networks of a field intelligence service. Yeah? I'd also say, as a shock, as a socialist, right, to discover that most people in the intelligence communities really care about people. That's actually been a quite interesting discovery, both in Britain and in the US on that. Right? So understanding the human networks was key, and that was when we got into human sensor networks. And it comes back to the point is how do governments create asymmetric advantage against asymmetric threat? Because you can't match asymmetric threat with symmetric information processing. And that was when we got into distributed intelligence. And I'd actually say one of the things which distresses me about KM is it's still entirely focused on codification and using algorithms to interpret data, and it still confines human beings to a community of practice, but then they've got to be in the community of practice, which is explicit as well. And it's actually failed to recognize that there's a whole body of human intelligence which is socially distributed, which requires social interaction. Yeah, and actually we're impoverishing the field by the way we practice.
Do you know, it's interesting. I've forgotten the name of the person who said this, you may know. It's a wonderful thing. It is impossible for a man to make a list of things that would never occur to him. And it is fascinating that when news comes to organizations, it always comes out of left field.
You see, that's
because that's where you don't have censors out there. So it's always really disruptive news is always a surprise.
It's more than that. It's human memory, all right? It's triggered by context. So we only know what we know when the context triggers the memory of that knowledge. Yeah, and the other thing is the way we remember things is different. Yeah, after we've done them. So even give it 4 or 5 hours, describe what you did, you'll remember it differently.
My wife is a biographer, and one of the things that she knows is that people rearrange the chronology of their own lives so that the story makes sense. And she will find that somebody put wrote a letter before this, and they will then deny it because they put things into retrospective coherence.
Which is the complexity phrase, right?
Yeah.
We readjust the past to meet the political expediencies of the present.
Or
right?
whatever makes
and
me look good.
All human beings do that, all right?
Yeah.
So you can't trust on that sort of retrospective work, right? And again, that starts to move into what's called real-time or distributed KM, right? And what really matters is your ability to deploy human agents to look at a problem, not your ability to codify what they think they remember about the past.
So you sound like Gary Hamel saying the key to competitive advantage is to be able to learn faster.
Yeah, possibly, but Gary tends to change his view based on what the latest fashion is. So you'll have to tell me which period of Gary that was. Yeah,
that's right.
I'm going to put you guys on pause for a second there because that is, I think, something important about the knowledge sharing business. It's all about, well, not all, but a major part is learning. How do you get up and running faster? How do you onboard people so that they learn what they need to do to solve those problems? How do you get the continuity of knowledge so that when those terrific engineers retire, that you've got that continuity of knowledge? Because we're talking about people, those human assets, right? So what would you have to say about that?
I think 2 things. First of all, I would get rid of any certification scheme whatsoever to do with knowledge management. Yeah, if you want to learn about knowledge, then go and do some anthropology, go and do some sociology, go and do some cognitive science, go and do some philosophy. Yeah, go and do some basic biology, understand evolution. Yeah, because actually that way you're going to be a generalist, and knowledge management needs generalists. Yeah, the certification schemes in Agile has gone down. Agile is going exactly the same route as KM. Commodification into certification schemes and people being given letters after their name for just regurgitating information, right? So that's a problem, right? But there is an availability because we need generalists in KM, not specialists, right? The other thing is in onboarding, some of the work we do, for example, is to make new employees keep a narrative-based learning journal for their first 3 months, and then send them to interview senior members of staff on a weekly basis. because senior members of staff will tell stories about knowledge to junior members of staff that they will not tell consultants. So you need to build this sort of transgenerational integration at a narrative level, and organizations desperately need cognitive diversity. And actually, one of the big problems, and we're seeing this all the way around the map, cognitive diversity is reducing in organizations, behavioral diversity is reducing in organizations, and we're destroying resilience in that process. I partly blame Peter Senge for this. Well, I blame Peter Senge for a lot of things, including making learning organization a religious cult, all right? But his fundamental problem is if everybody was actually aligned behind one set of objectives and values, organizations would be destroyed by their lack of adaptability. You actually need coherent diversity in an organization. Organizations need to be heterogeneous, not homogeneous, if they're going to adapt.
Actually, that was a good point that Amy Wilkinson made on our first morning when she talked about, diversity. When we talk about it in terms of, color, race, whatever, and she said it's the cognitive diversity that we definitely need.
Well, cognitive and experiential, too,
Yep.
which may, and of course your experiences shape your mind, but you
Yeah.
also want people to be reminded of different experiences, which is where some of those other more immediately recognizable diversities
Yeah,
come in. But one of the things that Dave was saying is interesting. I was thinking about, this is a field that over 20, 30 years has developed a body of knowledge, and some of it is useful. A lot of it is useful. And so in Michael Porter's metaphor of the productivity frontier, those things which are commodified and which everybody can do, there are more of them, and that's not necessarily something you should throw out and get back to first principles, because there are some things. But one of the things that Dave has done over years, that one of the things that really struck me and strikes me about knowledge management in general, is that too often people are not sophisticated about asking what kind of problem they're trying to solve. And Dave's Cynefin framework, which we can talk to you about, is a little bit about this. But I remember encountering this when I was doing some work with Cemex. And Cemex, you may know, is the big cement maker, and they make cement. And Cemex grew. Cement making is the most macho thing you've ever seen. It makes automobile assembly plants look like Tinker Toys, right? This is macho, dusty stuff, and it's very capital intensive. And Cemex needed to create a defense after NAFTA. You remember NAFTA? After NAFTA, Cemex was afraid that other cement makers would come into its little place in Mexico, and they decided, we are going to have to go out and grow aggressively to create a fortress. Well, in a highly capital-intensive business, you do not go by building another cement factory next to the other guys. You grow by acquisition. So they grew by acquisition, and that's in the cement business. They also had a business of sort of much more local, like pouring concrete cement for garages, getting to local contractors, construction people, paving city roads, and so on and so forth. So you got the macho stuff and you got this other stuff. Two very different businesses with two very different knowledge problems. Right? This acquisition problem is, we know the technology, how do we buy a company, how do we evaluate, do due diligence, buy it, put in a SWAT team and fix it up. So that, by the way, the working capital from that could pay for the next acquisition, because they were doing this during the Mexican currency crisis. So they couldn't go to banks. So that was a very formal, apply what we know, do it again and again. There's a nail, bam. There's another nail, bam. There's another nail, bam. This other stuff was, how do you get to the mayor? How do you get permits in Waco, Texas versus someplace in Berlin or outside a suburb of Berlin? And that turned out to be much more like a Yammer site, where people could share unstructured insight. What did you do? What are your regulations like? By the way, does anybody know the mayor's daughter? Yes, I go to school. And a completely different problem that resulted in completely different KM solutions.
Okay, so
worked.
let's build on that. And I think one of the key things which I think knowledge management professionals now need to start to do is to deal with unarticulated needs, not articulated needs.
Yes.
Because the issue is, it's the questions you don't know you need to ask which give you advantage. And the key principle on this, and this is the new approach we've been developing on design thinking, because ADEO has gone down the same route as knowledge management and everything else, highly commodified, highly structured, right? And what you actually need to do is you need to, because people don't know what technology can do these days. I mean, very few people understand it to actually put in a request. And what you really want to be able to do is to repurpose existing capability to meet unarticulated needs, because that's where you get strategic advantage. So if you go back in the history of IT, IBM repurposed punch card technology to become the dominant predator of computing for a long period of time. Gives them first mover advantage. Microsoft takes some code they developed for IBM, which they kind of like got from somebody else anyway, and repurpose that to create Windows, and then they all miss the fact that Apple is coming along and realizes that hardware and software are irrelevant, and Steve Jobs repurposes Next, which had gone bankrupt. Yeah? I claim some aspect of that, by the way. Steve Jobs threw a pile of books at me once, and I'm really proud of that moment. It's the only time I met him, and he threw a pile of books at me. Right?
Is that
No, that's the scar is from falling on Trivan, right?
Okay,
That's another matter,
yeah.
right? But this becomes really important, because, and I said this in one of the other sessions, if knowledge management wants to survive, it's got to become strategic. It isn't strategic anymore. When you and Leif were there, it was a board-level appointment. That doesn't apply anymore. If you want to become strategic, you've got to do things which aren't the conventional stuff that executives want you to do. You've got to actually make a strategic difference. So the ability to deploy things that you're very good at in completely new areas that people didn't realize they could be applied to, that's where you get strategic advantage.
Yeah. So last year I was talking about the thing that I've been sort of noodling at a little bit, which is what do companies know about what their customers know? And what's the customer's, last year I was talking about the customer's knowledge journey, because in the design thinking area, particularly in service design, you talk about journeys and you map journeys. But very little of that journey mapping that's done in design thinking things is actually about what is the customer, I mean, you almost take an old process map and you say, where is the customer's process and what does she know, need to know, think she knows, you need to unlearn and where is that customer going to go? If you look at some of the work, for instance, this is in the buying area, you did this work before she did with IBM, that Adele Rivella has done about making complex sales. And she talks about, what is the buying journey that goes on and who is the person who's the buyer and then who's the economic buyer up there, who's the boss, what are their priorities, how do you understand? And there seems to me to be a whole bunch of knowledge management ideas, technologies, approaches, things that are locked up inside the house that would be better if they were on the skin of the house, trying to learn more about the unarticulated needs of customers, particularly their unarticulated needs. What do they, with services especially, what do they need to know before they pull out that credit card or sign that purchase order? And where are they getting that knowledge?
So how do we help our organizations articulate better some of these things? How do we get to those, customer needs, or how do we get to those threats that may be out there that we're not really recognizing? How do we articulate some of those issues so that, we can have knowledge sharing processes and whatever that help our, senior management make those decisions and have the right stuff to make those decisions?
There's a whole variety of methods and tools. I mean, it's the main thing we do. It's the stuff we did to identify terrorist weak signal detections, yeah, which is basically gathering people's continuous day-to-day descriptive narratives of their lives, interpreted into high abstraction metadata. So that's one way. That's the sort of software developed. But you can do it just by being curious.
Yep.
I mean, the key thing is to not ask direct questions, but to ask indirect questions. Yeah, you never discover novelty if you ask a direct question, which means you need to be curious, all right? And you need to deploy multiple knowledge asset bases. I'll give you an example. The first project I did after I left IBM, because IBM couldn't cope with this project, all right? Because what we did is we brought together people from 3 South African banks, half a dozen pharmaceutical companies, some American health boards, yeah? And we took them to Saskatoon to a First Nation spiritual center. And we put them through a full spirit journey, right? This is the drums and everything else, right?
This is different from the Buddhists you were
Now,
talking about.
this was a lot of fun.
This worked for you.
Because also we were trying to find out the pretentious guys. Anybody who discovers a spirit animal on their first spirit journey is playing games, all right? So we had them marked, all right? But they then discovered that the shaman, one of them was a Nobel Prize winning chemist and the other was a major doctor, and they didn't realize that. So it was a shake-up thing. And then they articulated all of the current issues or problems they had at a finely grained level. And we had 30 or 40 people from different academic backgrounds who were actually doing the same thing in parallel with what they knew. They'd never taught together as disciplines before. Then we mashed them together in a workshop environment, and that was the one which ended up with a Lutheran liturgical design technique being deployed to handle knowledge transfer in a hospital in Bellingham. Because liturgical design is compressing complex ideas into memorable form. Yeah? So that was kind of like 2 days, intensive, disruptive, convergence, divergence, bringing multiple different assets together, and we ended up with about 15 or 16 problems that people had only been vaguely aware of with concrete solutions they could go back to. So there's lots of things you can do, but you've got to think differently about the problem. And the traditional linear approach, this is why I think design thinking has become a disaster, is taking a highly linear approach to a complex problem.
The curiosity, it's interesting again. I'll go back to Amy Wilkinson the other day talking about curiosity and asking those questions and sort of getting to deeper things. This is one of my favorite books, I have to tell you, and it probably applies to this audience, is by Warren Bennis, Geeks and Geezers. Mm-hmm. Did you read that one? And one of the things that he says in terms of leadership is that you need to have neoteny. This is one of my favorite words, and I tell everybody because it's that having that curiosity, childlike curiosity throughout your life. You maintain that so that you ask some of these things. Why?
You know the other great Warren Bennis quote? It's a wonderful one. He said, social scientists suffer from physics envy. Mm-hmm. Which is a wonderful play on words, and it's absolutely dead spot on.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, I'm going to let you do that final story that you wanted to tell.
That one? Okay. So Tom and I really enjoyed this. All right. This is an IBM story. So I'm actually technically in marketing because research wouldn't host us because we did consultancy. And consultancy wouldn't host us because we did research, and you weren't allowed to do the two together.
Right.
And for services, you've got to do the two together. So marketing hosted us because we were interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that means I'm press trained, which is fascinating, all right? And I'm on standby to do press releases and stuff like this. Yeah. So I'm with my family and my mother in a castle in Wales, and I suddenly get this phone call from IBM's PR head worldwide, Harvey.
Yep.
And, I'm on the phone call, so, I'm standing up there, and he says, "You're in Fortune magazine." Tom was an editor of it at the time.
I remember this.
I said, so I look at my mother, and I say, "Oh, that's going in Fortune magazine. The boy's done well, right?" I said, "Oh, that's good, isn't it?" He said, "No, it's not. You're not allowed to give interviews to Fortune magazine." And I said, "Well, nobody's told me that." He said, "No, we don't tell people because they might get to hear about it."
And the reason for this, by the way, Luke Gerstner was the CEO of Fortune, and he had come in and shaken up the place after, and there was an article by a woman named Betsy Morris, Fortune writer, basically talking about how Lee Gerstner is doing a great job at IBM, has shaken up the place, and is a mean, tough son of a bitch. And it was the last part, the mean, tough son of a bitch part, that he didn't like, even though the rest of the article was what you might call a warm, wet kiss.
There was a theoretical ban, but they wouldn't tell anybody, right?
Yeah.
Now, then I played European Intellectual, which was a mistake, all right? So I've just woken up in the morning as a giant insect, have I? And discovered the guy had never read Kafka, so I had to explain that. You don't want to explain Kafka's Metamorphosis to an IBM executive while standing on a windy castle who's already pissed off anyway, right? So he says, "Well, I just want to be clear, you're not allowed to do this anymore." And I said, "Well, I'm very sorry, Tom's a personal friend, all right? He thinks Larry and I are two of the best people around in KM, which is really good for IBM. and I'm going to carry on talking to him. And he said, I'm telling you, you're not. Now, you should not do this to somebody who's Welsh. We have this long history of, So I said, well, I'm very sorry, I'm going to. And he said, well, you're going to come out here and talk about it, And I said, fine, give me a cost code. I'm not paying for it. So there was a splutter, and he gave me a cost code, all right? So, come out. And I phoned up Tom. I said, Tom, I've been banned from speaking to you. Can I take you out for lunch? So I get to New York, Tom and I go out for lunch, all right? I drive up to Somers, I meet Harvey, all right? He says, he's checked on my top cover by now, so he's getting a bit more polite than he was before, right? Top cover is important. And he says, I really want your assurance you're not going to do this. I said, well, I've just taken him out for lunch. And he looked at me and he said, I've paid for you to come over to tell you to do something that you've actually just done worse. And I said, yep.
Did I buy lunch or did you?
No, I bought it.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I bought it.
Because our rules would have me buy it, but I think in most circumstances I might have let you buy it so that you could put the expense report in after.
The hysterical thing
expense reporting is a very interesting knowledge management.
But the punchline is coming, right? So he basically says, okay. And now he's getting real. He says, and we end up with a deal, right? And he says, and I'm now allowed to talk to Tom Stewart as a knowledge management guru, but I'm not allowed to talk to Tom Stewart as an editor of Fortune magazine. And I said, is it my fault if the two Tom Stewarts talk to each other? And he said, don't push your luck, buddy. Right?
So this becomes an interesting knowledge sharing issue, and it also becomes a question of whether the left brain knows what the right brain is doing as well as anything else is concerned. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, we were talking about cognitive diversity, one of the things that is really interesting about a diverse group of people is that they remind you of the things you didn't remember that you already knew.
Yeah.
And so it is not possible for a person to make a list of things that could not occur to him, but there are many things that would not occur to me that I actually know. And that when talking to somebody else might occur to me, and we might create, a terrific opportunity to expand our knowledge because we're really sharing, particularly with these unstructured problems. With the structured problems, I may not want Dave in there interrupting because we're just trying to hammer the goddamn nails in.
Tom, you're much better at interrupting than I am. I'd never try and challenge you on that one. It's okay.
Well,
How
do you
many
want to
children
have?
were you among?
Aren't they wonderful
I
together?
was 4.
Oh, God, 4. Okay,
They
right,
could have
okay,
their
yeah,
own
yeah.
TV show, don't you think? Yeah. So should we ask them to do one last word on KM and something that'll make us come back here next year to talk about knowledge sharing? What's your final word?
Go and study something not to do with knowledge management from the natural sciences or from philosophy, and then you can start to do something.
Yep. It's that you when I first knew you talked a lot about ecologies and how there had to be a whole balance, and that's that cognitive diversity again.
Go and read Andy Clark's latest book, all right? I mean, he's a cognitive neuroscientist and a philosopher.
Say that again?
He's Andy Clark's latest book. I can't remember the name of it. He's a cognitive neuroscientist and he's a philosopher. He's a brilliant, eccentric guy. His first book, Being There, is seminal, right? But he's actually now identified, and sorry if anybody's offended by this, I've said this several times and I'm not going to apologise. We're all to some extent mentally ill, so there's kind of like a spectrum we live on, yeah? At one end of the spectrum, you're fully autistic. Yeah? And the trouble is, most technology these days is written by people who are autistic, who don't like talking with people, and that is a problem with AI. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got Donald Trump, by which whatever is said has to fit a narrow perception of the world. Now, the point he's made is we all sit somewhere on that spectrum. Yeah, and our ability to move around on that spectrum is key, because if you scan everything, you can't operate. If you're too narrow, you're blind. So when do you go broad? When do you go narrow? How do you use narrative as a part of that? How do you use other people? So that ability to understand that to some extent we're all actually cognitively blind, and to work with it rather than try and pretend we can work against it. But that book's a brilliant book.
Okay, good. Tom, last word.
Well, if I were going to say books, I would also say, it's really interesting. At one point, when I was at HBR, we did an article, Larry Prusek and Tom Davenport did an article in which they asked management gurus and it was Peter Drucker who once said the reason they're called guru is that charlatan is too long a word for a headline. But he asked gurus who your gurus were. And what was very interesting is that apart from Jim March and a couple of other people who was about let's go take a walk in the woods and discuss things, most of these gurus, the gurus were people like Fernand Braudel. They were historians and other people. And I would just echo Dave's thinking. I remember years ago I was asked for the best books on leadership. And I said the three best books on leadership were the history plays of Shakespeare, The Prince by Machiavelli, and the Letters of St. Paul, which are actually the most extraordinary stories of an entrepreneur building a large organization with entrepreneurial energy. And if you read those things as leadership books, you find none of which are taught. Maybe The Prince is taught in business school, and you might read Henry V, but none of those things is taught. And I think that's the kind of thing that helps you frame the question. Unless you ask a good question, you're not going to get a good answer. And I think that's the most important
and the other
knowledge
thing
management
to
skill,
remember
is question raising.
Is in evolutionary terms, abstraction is key to human intelligence.
Yeah.
Art comes before language in human evolution. Yeah, the evolutionary advantage of art is it allows us to go up a level of abstraction and make novel connections, and which is why the focus on STEM education is essentially a disaster for humanity. Yeah, and the same is true in organizations. If you can't go to the theater, go to music, read books, read novels, you're losing intelligence. Yeah, and we're really should be about intelligence, not necessarily knowledge.
Yep, we have to have that bigger picture and be able to see, as you say, the weak signals in it. You brought up Drucker, and that was one of the things when I heard him speak. He talked many years ago about, he didn't use the term weak signals, but that's what he was saying. You know, pay attention to that stuff that's happening on the edge, because that may be what's important instead of the majority of common things that you see in the middle. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed our repartee up here and got some insights, some things to look into. And they'll be here for a couple of minutes if you want to chat with them. But again, next year, November 4th to 7th here. And call for speakers goes in January. You will get an online survey, and if you've been on the YAP app, you could have comments on our sessions as well, because we really do look forward to your feedback. My email address is in the speaker directory, and you can always send me direct feedback as well, because we pay attention to it and we love to hear from you. So thank our speakers, and thank you all for being here.